Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. Sorry that we're a bit late, but we were also in a class and then came right here. Welcome to another of our lectures in the Israel-Palestine Distinguished Lecture Series. Today, it's my distinct honor to present to you Professor Derek Penslar, who is a professor of history at Harvard and is assuming the William Lee Frost Chair in Modern Jewish History at Harvard. He taught in the past, or quite recently, at Oxford, Toronto, and Indiana universities. He has published numerous volumes in Jewish history, and I'll just cite a few of the titles of his works. These include Zionism and Technocracy, the Engineering of Jewish Settlement in Palestine, 1870-1918, published in 1991, In Search of Jewish Community, Jewish Identities in Germany and Austria, 1960-1933, Shylock's Children, Economics and Jewish Identity in Modern Europe, Orientalism and the Jews, which he co-edited with Ivan Kalmar, Israel in History, The Origins of the State of Israel, and Jews and the Military, a History. So you can see a vast range of topics that have to do with Zionism and Jewish history in a wide scope. Today, he will speak to us on an emerging project that he's now writing, as he told us over lunch, Declarations of Independence, Dialectics of Zionist Statecraft, 1896 to 1948. Please help me welcome Professor Penslar.
Thank you. Okay, so, will I be able to see my notes? Or if there's anything I can put them on, or does this go up?
You need something?
Well, because of my terrible vision, that's why I printed out in 16 points. Is there maybe a big, thick book, or does this go up? This doesn't go up, does it? I mean, I can always hold the... Or it'd have to be, unfortunately, a few feet of big books.
Any more books? Look at that.
Well, that'll help.
How's that?
Yeah, I'll try and see what happens. It's going to be a stretch. What do people do who don't have bad eyes? Do they really have the text all the way down there? And
You can have that.
yeah, we'll see what happens.
In my bag.
Yeah.
Maybe the bag first. No,
Okay. Let's see what happens.
no, this is
No.
going to fall. No,
Yeah, okay.
I don't think so.
Engineering.
How's that? Try that.
I think so. There we go. It works. Okay, let's hear it for what they call in Hebrew iltur, which means improvisation. Okay, well, thank you, Omer, very much for the introduction. Again, thank you for the invitation. I've had a delightful day here so far, meeting so many of the students and faculty members. It's been really a pleasure. What I'm going to do is share with you a kind of a shortened form of an article that's being published, where are we now, April? So it's going to be published in a couple of months. Oh, a rubbish bin, how lovely.
Empty. Recycling.
Take my bag.
That's perfect. That's a metaphor. That's
Sorry.
that's lovely.
This is perfect.
Recycling is even a more disturbing academic metaphor than rubbish. All right. So this is a shortened version of an article that I'm publishing in a journal in the next 6 to 8 weeks. And although it's not exactly on target with my next project, it grows out of my new project, which is a study of emotions in the history of Zionism. It's a book called Zionism: An Emotional State. And you'll see how some of the emotions that are at play in this article relate to that broader theme, although the theme of this article is actually much more political than it is cultural. So I'm going to analyze the relationship between dependence and independence in 4 foundational texts in the history of Zionism. Theodor Herzl's The Jewish State of 1896, the Balfour Declaration of 1917, the Biltmore Program of 1942, and the Declaration of the Establishment of the State of Israel in 1948. These documents differ greatly in authorship, structure, and audience, but taken together, they illustrate the Zionist project's convergence with but also divergence from, anti-colonial projects and post-colonial states in the first half of the 20th century. Both the political program that Herzl sketched out in The Jewish State and Chaim Weizmann's lobbying of the British government during World War I depended upon the good graces of Europe's colonial powers. After the war, jubilation among Jews about the Balfour Declaration was accompanied by displays of gratitude. Key in our talk is the emotion of gratitude, which is associated with conditions of dependence. If you're grateful to someone, you're in a dependency relationship with them. Like anti-colonialism in India, Zionism was cautious about demanding outright independence, although the Zionists' dependence upon Britain was far greater, given their status as a minority of Palestine's population and facing a hostile Arab majority. When the Zionists did demand independence in the Biltmore Program, they also acknowledged their ongoing dependence upon Britain, which they called upon to fulfill its mandatory responsibilities. In 1948, the Zionists did not separate from Britain so much as Britain separated from Palestine. The Palestine War that year was a struggle between Israel and Arabs, not between Israel and Britain. Accordingly, the state's founding declaration was an assertion of creation and not separation, of sovereignty, not independence from another power. Nonetheless, the document reflected dependence upon the international community that had approved Palestine's partition in November of 1947. So in one paragraph, that's the entire argument of the paper. The rest is commentary. So we begin with Herzl, with whom I've lived for far too long. The book I've been working on about him will hopefully be finished this summer. The Zionist organization's Basel program, adopted at the First Zionist Congress, was highly ambiguous about the precise form that a Jewish polity would assume. The program ran, Zionism aims at establishing for the Jewish people a publicly and legally assured home in Eretz Israel. That ambiguity reflected differences of opinion between so-called political and practical Zionists, between those who demanded Jewish sovereignty and those who preferred, for tactical or for principled reasons, to focus on Jewish economic and social development within Ottoman Palestine without clear plans for the political future of Palestine's Jewish community, known in Hebrew as the Yishuv. But there was more to the Basel program's ambiguity, for it characterized the thinking and stratagems of the Zionist organization's founder, Theodor Herzl. In 1896, the year before the First Zionist Congress and the promulgation of the Basel program, Herzl published his celebrated pamphlet, Der Judenstaat, usually translated as the Jewish State. The pamphlet proposed the formation of what he called a society of Jews that would be a state-creating power. The society of Jews, he writes, will treat with the present masters of the land, putting itself under the protectorate of the European powers, if they prove friendly to the plan. Now this is interesting, because the current masters of the land are the Ottoman Empire, but then he says, placing itself under the protection, or the protectorate, of the European powers, if they prove friendly. Now, what does Herzl mean by protectorate? He employs the German word Protektorat, not Schutzgebiet, the term employed in the German Empire to describe its colonial possessions in Africa. He does not appear to have in mind a protectorate in the conventional sense of the word. That is, an entity with a high level of internal autonomy, but whose external affairs are under the control of a foreign state. Rather, Herzl goes on to write, we should, as a neutral state, remain in contact with all of Europe, which would have to guarantee our existence. In other words, Protektorat simply means protection in the form of a collective European security guarantee. Moreover, when Herzl describes the financial instrument of the Zionist project, known as the Jewish Company, as, quote, under the protection of England, close quote, he means that it will be a joint stock company, registered in London, and protected by the fairness and global reach of British commercial law. The Society of Jews and the Jewish Company would be autonomous entities, but they would depend upon the goodwill of Christians to buy the property of aspiring Jewish immigrants at a fair price. To quote Herzl, honest anti-Semites, whilst preserving their independence, will combine with our officials in controlling the transfer of our estates. Anti-Semites would even buy shares in the Jewish Company. The Zionists would repay their kindness, says Herzl, by giving, quote, every assistance to governments and parliaments in their efforts to direct the inner migration of Christian citizens to formerly Jewish properties. Herzl was deeply concerned about the reputation and honor of Europe's Jews, leading him to write that, quote, every obligation in the old country must be scrupulously fulfilled before leaving. Every just private claim originating in the abandoned countries will be heard more readily in the Jewish state than anywhere else. We shall not wait for reciprocity. We shall act purely for the sake of our own honor. This pamphlet brims with psychological dependence on Gentile opinion of the Jews that matches political dependence upon the international community to guarantee the state's existence. The final sentence of Herzl's pamphlet declaims that unlike the consequences of previous waves of Jewish emigration, Jewish money will no longer flee abroad with its owners. Instead, it will flow back to the Jews' former homelands for the benefit of their erstwhile neighbors. And in one of the pamphlet's most famous passages, Herzl foresees the protection of the holy sites by, quote, assigning to them an extraterritorial status such as is well known in the law of nations. We shall form a guard of honor about these sanctuaries, answering for the fulfillment of this duty with our existence. The Jews will guard the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. He's not really thinking of the Dome of the Rock or the Al-Aqsa Mosque. He's thinking of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And that the Jews will guard these Christian holy sites with their very lives to protect their honor. A vision of a neutral Jewish state guaranteed by the European powers, a vision that is conditional upon their interest and their agreement if they prove friendly to the plan, he writes. This conditional clause testifies to flexibility and opportunism inherent in Herzl's diplomatic activity. In the years following the publication of Der Judenstaat, Herzl pursued multiple and mutually contradictory diplomatic initiatives. Negotiating with the Ottoman government, he avowed that an imperial charter allowing Jews to settle Palestine would help the empire maintain its independence and integrity. In a 1902 draft charter for a colonization company that would operate in Ottoman Palestine and surrounding lands, Herzl presented the Zionists as loyal subjects of the Ottoman Sultan. The document stressed the Jews' willingness to perform military service, this at a time when the empire did not even have universal conscription. Herzl never ceased, however, at the same time that he was courting the Ottoman Empire, courting the European powers, particularly Britain and Germany, one of which he hoped would proclaim a protectorate, not the protection, over Palestine or some other territory on behalf of the Jews. Is there anybody here from Southern California by any chance? Nobody is here from Southern California? One person. You know about the meaning of 90210? I really am out of my element. No one knows 90210. What is it?
Zip code for
Beverly Hills. That's right. And the most important thing, if you're growing up in Los Angeles and you can't afford to live in Beverly Hills, is you live in what's called Beverly Hills adjacent. Okay? You have a prestigious, a yichastic or a prestigious zip code that's similar to Beverly Hills. So in case of Herzl, he was hoping for a Jewish state, if not in Palestine, Palestine adjacent, something nearby. Now, Herzl was a native of Hungary, a country that under the terms of the 1867 Ausgleich, or compromise with Austria, enjoyed near total autonomy, but not sovereignty. He was thus intimately familiar with the preservation of loyalty to a non-native dynasty within a highly nationalistic society. At the fin de siècle, such phenomena existed far beyond Europe. In 1895, a Taiwanese Republic was proclaimed following the Sino-Japanese War, and the Republic's president, Tang Jing-song, proclaimed himself to be a loyal servant of the Qing Emperor. Herzl never explicitly invoked Austria-Hungary or China, or joint or sub-sovereignty, but he was effusive in protestations of loyalty and benevolence to the Jewish state's future suzerain. As Herzl said at the beginning of the Second Zionist Congress in 1898, quote, if there is such a thing as a legitimate claim to any piece of the earth's surface, then all the peoples of the earth who believe in the Bible must recognize the rights of the Jews. And they can do so without envy or concern, for the Jews are not a political power, and they never will be one again. It's fascinating. The author of Der Judenstaat says the Jews are not a political power and never will be one again. Herzl's pamphlet bore the title The Jewish State, but he was vague, unsure, flexible about the form that the polity would take. Sovereign state, a vassal, or a satrapy, or an autonomous region. As Herzl said in a debate in Berlin in 1898, well, what is a state? A big colony. What is a colony? A small state. In this deeply apologetic approach, Herzlian Zionism represented a continuation and not a rejection of what modern Jewish historians have called an Enlightenment theory of political passivity, that is, a historic Jewish dependence upon the state. Herzl continued in the spirit of the radical German Jewish reformer David Friedlander, who in 1787, more than a century before Herzl, wrote of the Jews as, quote, a dislocated but not useless limb in the state machine. With childlike longing, we await the moment of mobilization. You see, the invocation of Jewish financial power, which Herzl claimed would be sufficient to restructure the Ottoman Empire's vast sovereign debt, was also an assertion of utility and a yearning to be mobilized in the service of the great powers. A similar mixture of empowerment and dependence characterized contacts between Zionists and British government officials leading up to the promulgation of the Balfour Declaration, as well as Zionist representations of it in the following years. So we've laid out the framework with Herzl, independence, which really is all about dependence upon the great powers. Let's see how this plays out as we move to Chaim Weizmann, the Zionist leader most responsible for negotiating the declaration. Weizmann gained access to the British governing elites in part owing to his pre-war chemical experiments on the fermentation of grain sugars, which he intensified during the war in order to synthesize acetone, an ingredient in smokeless gunpowder. Now, these genuine scientific accomplishments quickly took on the qualities of legend among Jews throughout the world. According to a Chicago Jewish newspaper, a fortnight after the issuance of the Declaration, quote, as a chemist, Weizmann is the inventor of a high explosive now in use by British forces on the Western Front. He declined to take any reward for his contribution to the success of the war, asking in exchange nothing more than that the British government should listen to the appeal of the Zionists and approve their ambitions. Now, aside from the exaggeration, Weizmann did not invent the explosive. He amplified the availability of one of its components. We have a folktale narrative of a loyal servant of the crown who wins royal favor for extraordinary service, thereby gaining privileges for his people. The story harkens to biblical stories of Joseph or Mordecai in the books of Genesis and Esther, respectively, Sephardic courtiers in medieval Spain, or early modern court Jews whose wealth brought residence privileges for entire communities, or Jews thought to be masters of esoteric knowledge in early modern Europe, alchemists, depicted brilliantly by Daniel Jutta in his recent book on the relationship between Jews, royal secrecy, and alchemical science. Weizmann was a master of the pre-modern Jewish vertical alliance, a political strategy whereby Jews sought the protection of the king or emperor rather than local lords. As historian Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi has brilliantly observed, Jews represented themselves as servants of kings rather than mere servants of men. Weizmann may have been adored by his following, but in his negotiations with the British government, he was a supplicant before a monarch. Weizmann would, in years to come, refer to himself as a beggar and a schnorrer, which is Yiddish for beggar, so it's a tautological statement. But anyway, a beggar and a schnorrer in the service of the Zionist movement. This operational dialectic between subordination and sovereignty, reliance and self-reliance, within the negotiations leading up to the issuing of the Declaration, became a discursive dialectic as the Declaration was publicly celebrated at the end of 1917 and afterwards. Gratitude was commonly invoked by Zionists to describe Jews' feelings towards Britain. On December 16, 1917, a joint meeting of American and Canadian Zionists passed, quote, appropriate resolutions of gratitude for the Declaration. In December of 1918, a Spanish Zionist convention in Madrid resolved to send a note of congratulations and gratitude to the British ambassador. This rhetoric continued over time, with the League of Nations award of the mandate over Palestine to Britain in 1920 and the appointment of Herbert Samuel as the first High Commissioner to Palestine. Gratitude was a response to a gift or an act of charity. Sorry, gratitude was not a response merely to a gift or act of charity, but rather to the legitimization of the Zionist project itself. So at the 1921 convention of the Canadian Zionist Federation, a resolution acknowledged, quote, the deepest gratitude and indebtedness of the Jewish people to the British government for this declaration, written into the public law of nations, which recognizes the right of the Jewish people to a home in Palestine, and which is to make possible the establishment of a Jewish homeland. More baldly, in American fashion, in 1927, the Los Angeles B'nai B'rith Messenger described the declaration as the first recognition by a modern nation of the Jewish claim to Palestine as a national homeland. These statements then are complicated. They invoke both an inalienable right, but also dependence on a great power to recognize that right and make possible its exercise. In the United States, Jewish reactions to the declaration were varied. Yiddish-speaking socialists and highly acculturated Reform Jews both expressed misgivings, the former out of distaste for imperialism, and the latter out of discomfort with distinct Jewish nationalism. In Canada, however, the rhetoric of Jewish gratitude for the declaration was ubiquitous. Unlike Jews in Eastern Europe, where masses of Orthodox Jews viewed Zionism with skepticism or suspicion, if not outright hostility, or in Western Europe, where assimilationists were no less hostile to Zionism, or the United States, where both radical and assimilationist ideologies limited Zionism's appeal. Jews in Canada came of age in a binational society where minorities faced little resistance to the performance of ethnic solidarity and the establishment of unifying national institutions. What's more, as an outpost of the British Empire, Zionism could be presented, in the words of Archie Freeman, the Zionist Organization of Canada president in 1924, quote, a joint enterprise between the British people and the Jewish people. There's an interesting visual representation of Canadian Jewish gratitude. In Toronto, my adopted home city, the Schiffer Hillman Clothing Company commissioned architect Benjamin Brown to design a regal Art Deco structure whose drawings from the very start bore the name Balfour Building. It was opened to great fanfare in 1930. In another act of commemorative naming, during the Second World War, at a time when restrictive covenants prevented Jews from purchasing desirable lakeshore cottage properties north of Toronto, the Zionist activist Rose Dunkelman, mother of the Major Benjamin Dunkelman from the 7th Brigade in 1948 war. Anyway, the Zionist activist Rose Dunkelman arranged through a third party to purchase lakeshore land for the establishment of a Jewish cottage community, opened in 1942 and named Balfour Beach. I know of no other examples, by the way, of this kind of commemorative naming. There's a Balfour institution in Vancouver, but it's simply named after Balfour as foreign minister. It has nothing to do with Jews. And it really tells you something about the difference between Canadian and American Jewry. This complex and ambiguous relationship between gratitude and dependence on one hand, and pride and independence on the other, is even more illustrated by the practices of likening the Balfour Declaration to Magna Carta. On the occasion of the Declaration's 5th anniversary, the chairman of Keren HaYesod in the United States, Charles Untermeyer, said the Declaration, like the mandate, followed as the new Magna Charta, C-H-A-R-T-A, of the Jewish people the world over. Under the beneficent protection of the mandate, the Jews will be able to return to their native land and pursue their vocations in peace and prosperity. Both Nachum Sokolov and Chaim Weizmann invoked the simile. And in his testimony before the Peel Commission in November of 1936, Weizmann vowed that he could submit to the commission, I'm quoting from Weizmann, a series of utterances of responsible statesmen and men in every walk of life in England to show that this declaration was regarded as the Magna Carta of the Jewish people. It was, in a sense, comparable with yet another declaration made thousands of years before, when Cyrus allowed a remnant of the Jews to return from Babylon and to rebuild their temple. By the way, sympathetic Christians also made this analogy between the Balfour Declaration and Magna Carta. Now, these invocations are quite striking when you think of what Magna Carta was. Magna Carta was a concession of aristocratic privilege by an unpopular king to his rebellious barons. Now, it's true that at the time Weizmann was writing, the charter was also widely interpreted as adumbrating modern notions of individual right. Nonetheless, even this more generous interpretation of Magna Carta presents it as a royal charter bestowed from on high, as opposed to a declaration drafted by a popularly elected body. Weizmann's explicit comparison of the Balfour Declaration with not only Magna Carta, but also Cyrus's edict, strengthens the notion that the Jews have long depended upon the beneficence of imperial power. Zionists were not the only stateless or colonized people to invoke Magna Carta. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Indian and South African activists did the same, but they did not do so to display gratitude to a great power for acknowledging their historic rights. Rather, to juxtapose current British discrimination against what they believed to be older, binding proclamations of equality and promises of protection by Britain to its colonies. At the end of World War I, anti-colonial leaders in countries such as India, Egypt, China, and Korea looked to the international community to recognize their rights to self-determination. They neither wanted nor needed a protector. In December of 1918, a statement by the American Jewish Congress breathed the spirit of this era, which my Harvard colleague Erez Manella has called its Wilsonian moment. So I'm quoting from the American Jewish Congress. President Wilson has broken all precedents and has sailed for Europe. So he's off to Paris for the peace conference. Presumably to impress upon European leaders that America will no longer hold aloof from the old world, but by force of changed conditions is now one of them. They weren't quite right about that. President Wilson's voyage to France symbolizes the new position of America in the world's affairs. Neutral nations need not tremble for the freedom of the seas, for the seas will now be as free as the air. Moving from support for the League of Nations to the Zionist cause, this declaration from the American Jewish Congress urges that Jews must have complete and unhampered independence in their own land. How do they justify this claim? It's a moral claim. Quote, "The Jews do not go to Palestine to build warships, train armies, found arsenals, invent devilish and murderish machines, but to dwell in peace and cultivate the graces and the learning of civilization. Their continued peaceful existence in their homeland will depend upon the peace of the world." So it sounds as if the Zionists are trying to be of a piece with this Wilsonian moment, an anti-colonial moment. But there's a problem. Despite these lofty sentiments, Zionists found themselves in a fundamentally different position from the colonized world. Movements for independence in the Arab Middle East saw the mandates for Mesopotamia, Syria, and Palestine as an assault against their autonomy and collective rights, even if these mandates were allegedly supposed to guide them to self-government. The Zionists, on the other hand, were completely dependent upon imperial protection, without which the fledgling Yishuv could not survive, let alone thrive. Only with British help could the Zionists attain their goal, which in the immediate aftermath of the war was clearly one of statehood. Now, it was uncommon for mainstream Zionists to use language as bald as that of the Chicago Jewish Sentinel's front page, November 23, 1917, which declared, "The British government has promised to further the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine." Taking a different tack, after a meeting in Whitechapel in December 1918, Weizmann spoke of a Zionist program that has been developed with diplomatic tact. Although our ultimate aim will be the establishment of the Jewish nation in Palestine, with Jewish control and government, at present, the leaders of Zionism will not demand a Jewish state, because the Jews are now in the minority, and a protectorate with national rights under the guardianship of England is much more advisable. And like Weizmann, the American Jewish Congress did not make a secret of its long-term goals. Trusteeship of Great Britain, acting on behalf of such a League of Nations as may be formed, leading to the development of Palestine into a Jewish commonwealth. Now, the term commonwealth, they're just simply now quoting from the Balfour Declaration, that nothing will be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. Fine. But what do they mean by the term commonwealth? It was a synonym for a state. It reflects common usage at the time. It was an important component of Wilsonian rhetoric, which associated sovereignty with the common weal, the common good. This language was echoed by nearly simultaneous conventions of the American Workers of Zion in Philadelphia, which demanded an independent, neutral, internationally guaranteed republic under the protection of the League of Nations. And then in January 1919, the Canadian Zionist Federation called for a Jewish Commonwealth in Palestine. In February of 1919, Rabbi Stephen S. Wise, one of the most prominent Jewish leaders in America, spoke with assurance about a forthcoming trusteeship on behalf of the Jews of the world over Palestine. He directly compared the Zionist cause to that of the redemption of Belgium, that is the reconstruction of Belgium as an independent state, and the recreation of Serbia, sovereign, small, and fragile states. Now, the clarity and frequency with which American Zionists spoke of statehood for Palestine should come as no surprise, given that affirmations for Zionism came from the highest officers of the United States government. The United States Congress endorsed a Jewish Commonwealth under British guardianship in December of 1918. Another declaration of support came in May of 1922. Woodrow Wilson addressed a delegation of prominent American Jews in 1919, saying, "I am persuaded that the Allied nations, with the fullest concurrence of our government and people, are agreed that in Palestine shall be laid the foundation of a Jewish Commonwealth." Or as Wilson allegedly said privately to Stephen S. Wise, "Have no worries, Palestine will be yours." So among the Zionist public, expectations in the immediate post-Balfour area were unashamedly statist. Zionism's political elites may have initially shared that euphoria, but over time they became more circumspect and pragmatic in the face of the challenges of nation building, British fickleness, and Palestinian Arab numerical domination and opposition. And it's for this reason, and I'm kind of bucking against the historiographical trend here, but there's a lot of historians now who have been highlighting Zionist leaders' non-state or sub-state approaches to the future of the Jewish national home. And to some extent it's true, but I just wanted to point out the extent to which Jews in the public after World War I really expected a state was coming down the corner, but that Britain was going to give it to them. So this dialectic between dependence and independence. But Zionist leaders were a bit more circumspect. For example, Vladimir Jabotinsky, although known in Zionist collective memory as an ardent champion of Jewish statehood, actually developed a program that was entirely dependent on British protection and the incorporation of Jewish Palestine into the British Empire. In 1922, Jabotinsky suggested that he would be content if the Jewish national home were no more sovereign than Ontario within the Dominion of Canada. He did this kind of things many times. People would say, "Do you want a Jewish state?" He would say, "Tennessee is a state. Kentucky is a state." He even New South Wales is a state for the Australians in the audience. I like the comparison to Ontario. Oh, he also compared to Nebraska. The point is then that he was quite flexible what he meant by state. And Jabotinsky was the only major Zionist leader to embrace Josiah Wedgwood's 1928 call for the establishment of a Jewish Palestine as a seventh British Dominion. Now, normally in Canada, the students all know what the other six were, but in this country it might be a little tougher. Canada, Newfoundland. Newfoundland did not become part of Canada until the falsified referendum of 1949. Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and the Irish Free State. Jabotinsky claimed that even if Palestine became 99% Jewish, he would prefer that Palestine be part of the British Empire than that it be independent. Now, Jabotinsky's dependence on Britain is obvious, but less clear are his expectations. He wanted to see Britain abrogate the League of Nations mandate, declare Palestine a crown colony, and then move it toward dominion status. But what did the word dominion mean to him? By the end of the 1920s, the British Empire's dominions were effectively independent states. Each dominion had individually signed the Treaty of Versailles. And the 1926 Balfour Declaration, there was a second Balfour Declaration in 1926 that had nothing to do with Palestine, placed them in a position of equality with the United Kingdom. The ramifications of this second Balfour Declaration were made clear in the 1931 Statute of Westminster, which rendered the dominions legislatively independent, and Britain was no longer under any blanket obligation to defend them if they were attacked. So Jabotinsky really is not using the term dominion in its contemporary sense. He and Wedgwood speak directly of Palestine's special needs for military protection, which separate it from other dominions. Jabotinsky very much hoped that Jewish Palestine would be protected by Britain, and in return, the Jews of Palestine would fight in Britain's wars. This concept of the seventh dominion and the mother country as having significant mutual obligations was definitely something of an anachronism. In an era where, as Aryeh Dubnoff has written, the United Kingdom's approach to empire was increasingly informal in its embrace of a gradualist approach to the attainment of dominion status and its openness to levels of self-government that fell short of total sovereignty. The seventh dominion scheme appears closer to post-World War I British proposals regarding governance of India than the development of Anglo-Saxon settler dominions. Now, in India, there were important reforms in 1918 known as the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms, and they were incorporated into the India Act of 1919. They implemented a complicated system of limited self-rule called diarchy, with dominion to be attained only in a hazy future. Now, the Indian National Congress dismissed these reforms as inadequate, but of course, to be honest, most Zionists rejected the Seventh Dominion idea. So Jabotinsky was quite eccentric in this view of a Palestine that would be not sovereign, it would fight in Britain's wars, but Chaim Weizmann himself also was very gradualist and very much dependent on Britain in his own approach to the future of Palestine. So in the 1920s then, Zionist leaders were clearly obliged to perform a politics of dependence. True, though, few desired to deepen their colonial relationship with Britain. In the wake of the 1930 White Paper, which recognized a dual commitment to Jewish and Arab demands in Palestine, Zionist dissatisfaction with Britain began to accelerate. These tensions grew exponentially with the issuing of the 1939 White Paper, which abrogated the Balfour Declaration by throttling Jewish immigration and decreeing the establishment in 10 years' time of a unitary state with an Arab majority. And despite the uprooting of the foundation of the Zionist-British alliance in the face of the Nazi onslaught, the Zionist movement remained dependent on Britain. So this leads me to a briefer analysis of the Zionist movement finally beginning to renegotiate its dependence on Britain in 1942. At the outbreak of World War II, Britain counted on the Dominions to join the war effort. Most did enthusiastically, but they were not under imperial compulsion. Similarly, the British administration in Palestine encouraged volunteerism for the British armed forces and was eager to recruit Jews for the North African and Middle Eastern fronts. Recruitment rates, however, were low. Most young Palestinian Jews preferred to defend their homes and families. They did not want to risk their lives for a faraway empire. The number of Palestinian Jewish soldiers in the British Army climbed only after the June 1941 Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, which mobilized young leftists to defend communism against fascism, and the battles of El Alamein in 1942, which removed the threat of a German invasion of Palestine. Until the Irgun's famous revolt of 1944, the Zionist movement consistently endeavored to balance strivings for independence with ongoing dependence on Britain. And this penumbra of empire fell across the 1942 Biltmore Program, which demanded Jewish statehood in all of Palestine, using the term Commonwealth, but again, as I mentioned, it really means a state. David Ben-Gurion liked the word Commonwealth because he thought that American Jews would like it, because of its association with, again, with the common good. What's weird about the Biltmore Program is that it's often represented in textbooks as a kind of assertion of Jewish will, but if you read the text carefully, it is as deferential as it is assertive. It demands that Britain fulfill the original purposes of the Balfour Declaration and the Mandate. It is not a rebellion against Britain. It is replete with passive moods. The program, quote, urges that the gates of Palestine be opened, that the Jewish agency be vested with control of immigration into Palestine and with the necessary authority for upbuilding the country, and that Palestine be established as a Jewish commonwealth. In other words, Jewish sovereignty would be granted by the metropole. The Zionists were not going to take on anything on their own. This ongoing diplomacy of dependence was not unusual for mid-20th century state-seeking movements, clamoring for recognition by established state actors and by the international community. Dependence by anti-colonial liberation movements on patron states or clusters of states was the rule and not the exception. For example, in the 1950s, communist China supported the Viet Minh. A decade later, provided arms for the Southwest Africa People's Organization in Namibia. The Arab League helped finance the Front de Libération Nationale in Algeria. After 1967, the Soviet Union's KGB trained and armed Palestinian guerrillas. But the Zionist position vis-a-vis patron states was different. In the other cases of post-colonial state creation, diplomatic support by an outside power for a state-seeking movement was coupled with material and military assistance. And in fact, the latter was more important than the former. The Zionists, however, had no patron state. The United States' diplomatic recognition of Israel in 1948 was crucial, but the United States did not arm Israel, the way, say, China armed the Viet Minh. The Soviet Union allowed Czech arms sales to Israel, but they were sales. They were not gifts. It took another 3 years after the Biltmore Conference for the Jewish diaspora, primarily in the US, to become an avatar of a patron state and assume the burden of providing or paying for weapons and military equipment. So it's a very strange thing that the Zionists have to become their own patron state. It's this kind of self-reflexive quality that makes the Zionist case different from India or Vietnam or really any other case of anti-colonial, anti-regime, state-seeking action. The Biltmore Program, demanding that Britain fulfill the terms of the Balfour Declaration and the Mandate, did resemble an earlier document from a different part of the British Empire, the Indian National Congress's 1929 call on Britain to allow India to become independent. The Purna Swaraj Declaration reflected a break from and a continuation of the Congress's moderate policies. As Gandhi explained in 1930, the Indian National Congress championed, I'm quoting Gandhi, the inalienable right of the Indian people to have freedom and to enjoy the fruits of their toil and have the necessities of life. And to attain these freedoms, India must sever the British connection and attain Purna Swaraj, complete independence. For this reason, Gandhi rejected dominion status for India, even though by this time the dominions were functionally sovereign. Mainstream Zionism was also cautious. Reflecting the prospect of a minuscule Jewish state's ongoing vulnerability, Ben-Gurion was open, even after World War II, to maintaining quasi-imperial ties with Britain. He even hoped that a Jewish state would enter a post-war British Commonwealth. As in India, though, moderation did not dampen the desire for independence. In both India and Palestine, the political leadership's actions were promoted and complicated by armed resistance. Unlike India's anti-colonial struggle, the fate of the Zionist project was placed in the hand of the United Nations, whose partition resolution of November of 1947 legitimized Jewish statehood. And in the midst of the war that followed, Israel proclaimed its establishment via a document that departed from the long-established discourse of dependence and created a new, albeit idiosyncratic, rhetoric of political independence. So even the Biltmore Program had this notion of dependence upon Britain, an issue that even faced India in its concept of Purna Swaraj. It's a goal of independence, but Gandhi himself does not lead rebellion against Britain. So the final thing I want to talk about, relatively briefly, is Israel's founding declaration. Now, this declaration was written by many people. Moshe Sharet, David Ben-Gurion. Ben-Gurion himself played a major role in it. It's a very strange document. Very cursory reference to the Balfour Declaration, the mandate system, and the League of Nations. Britain isn't mentioned. That's very interesting. Britain isn't mentioned. Because it's not about Britain. It is about the historic and collective rights of the Jewish people to reconstitute a Jewish state in the biblical land of Israel. It finally decenters Britain and directly addresses the international community. And in this assertion of sovereignty and presentation of a national narrative, the Israeli declaration resembles declarations of independence produced over the last 240 years, a period characterized by my colleague David Armitage as a contagion of sovereignty. But the Israeli declaration differs from other declarations of independence. I know it sounds like Passover. You thought we were done with Passover. What makes this declaration different from all other declarations? But it's very interesting. It is an assertion of self-constitution, not separation. The declaration was made on May 14th, 1948, the last day of the British Mandate. So it could not be a declaration of independence from Britain. Britain was already leaving. And during the state's early years, the 1948 war was known as not only Milchemet Atzmaut, the War of Independence, but also the War of Komemiut, Milchemet Komemiut, standing tall, Komemiut. It comes from Leviticus. I broke the bars of your yoke and enabled you to walk erect. The official name of Israel's founding document is not the Declaration of Independence. That's not what you'll see on the Israeli Foreign Ministry website. It is the Declaration of the Establishment of the State of Israel. Now, why does this matter? If you look at every other Declaration of Independence, and Armitage has them all reproduced in his book, they all share a historic narrative of grievance against a particular country. If any of you remember the old TV show Seinfeld, the holiday Festivus? Remember Festivus? There were two components to the holiday. One was feats of strength, and the other was, remember? The airing of grievances. Exactly. For the United States, the country whose the object of grievance is Britain. Right. For Haiti, it is France. For the Republic of Texas, Mexico. For Hungary, the Habsburg Empire, and so on, until Vietnam's 1945 Declaration of Independence from France. Even Liberia, which was not a colony of any African polity, but rather an entirely new creation, still defines itself against the United States for basically compelling the African Americans of Liberia to contribute to the resources of a new country because the United States had treated them so shabbily. The Israeli Declaration, in contrast to all of these, has an inward-turn historical narrative for a list of grievances against an oppressor. The narrative links the ancient origins of the Jews, the biblical kingdoms, Herzl, the Balfour Declaration, the Holocaust, and the Partition Resolution. By the way, the Czechoslovak Declaration of Independence is similarly breathless. It covers hundreds and hundreds of years, stretching from Jan Hus to Woodrow Wilson. But it does have a dig against Habsburg oppression. They had to make sure that was there. The Yishuv leadership was unsure of the desired content and purpose of this document. And in fact, several different versions of it were proposed by April of 1948. And then an English-trained Israeli lawyer named Mordechai Bayam composed a lengthy draft of declaration. It's interesting what text he had in front of him as he was working on the declaration. He had the American Declaration of Independence, the Hebrew Bible, the English Bill of Rights of 1689, the text of the League of Nations Mandate for Palestine, and the United Nations Partition Resolution. Now, this is interesting. The American Declaration asserted sovereignty in an anarchic international community that had certain unifying conventions, but it did not have the formal structures of 20th century international organization. There was no United Nations in 1776. The Israeli Declaration assumes a need for international recognition, which came in various stages. Balfour Declaration, the award of the mandate, the partition resolution. All right, so you can see what the declaration is really doing. It is directed to the international community as a whole and inwardly to the people of the new state of Israel. This act of declaring independence, whether via rebellion or separation, as in most cases, or constitution of a new state within a geopolitical vacuum, as in Israel, is inherently a display of yet another kind of dependence. Not dependence on a patron state, not dependence on the colonial power, but dependence on the international community, which is clearly written in the Declaration's text, calling upon the international community to recognize the state and to prevail upon the Arabs to treat the Israelis, the new Jewish state with goodwill. In conclusion, all declarations of independence are aspirational, statements of intent and not of fact. At the time of Israel's founding, as for many countries asserting independence, there was an existential need for patronage or assistance. During the American Revolutionary War, the assistance came from the French, and 2 centuries later, during its own War of Komemiut, Israel purchased arms from France, Italy, and Czechoslovakia. But ultimately, it depended on diaspora Jews, for the funds without which it could not have defeated the Arab armies. In the 1948 war, Jews were both patron and client, in the diaspora and in the land of Israel. Similarly, Israel's declaration lacks references to an external oppressor. The Shoah, the Holocaust, is mentioned, but it is mentioned as an act of wanton destruction and not colonial oppression. A threnody is not the same as a litany. Despite this tactical and rhetorical self-sufficiency, the State of Israel has remained a dependent, searching less for allies, as would be the case for most sovereign states, than for protectors. From the mid-1950s until 1967, the most important patron was France. Thereafter, that role was assumed by the United States. The language of Israel's special relationship with the United States constitutes what is in many ways a radically different type of dependence than that which I have examined here for the period before 1948. That rhetoric deserves analysis on its own terms, but also against the historical context of a national movement, Zionism, that seemed to always crave recognition for what it claimed to know itself to be. Thank you. Look forward to your questions and comments.
Hi, thank you very much for all of that. I had a question about the piece about especially build-up to Balfour.
Yeah.
You talked a lot about Herzl, Weizmann, and Jabotinsky, and the way that they conceived of Zionism's relationship. Oh, thank you. Conceived of Zionism's relationship to Britain and other colonial powers. But I'm wondering if, at that same time, there were others involved in the Zionist movement. First of all, coming within Europe from the political left, people like Nachman Sirkin and Berberachov, and also outside of Europe, people like Eliyahu Eliachar and more of the Sephardi and Mizrahi Zionist activity and thought that had much more to do with union with the Arab and Islamic world. And I'm wondering how those kinds of leftist and Mizrahi and Sephardi Zionisms might have interacted with and possibly disagreed with the more colonialist take of Herzl and Weizmann.
That's a very good question. I'm not sure, frankly, because this is a contribution to the history of something that happened. The fact is, the people who mattered, the people who were, Weizmann was the one talking to James Arthur Balfour and talking to Lloyd George, whereas the people you were mentioning were not. So this is very much a paper about elites, and elites who were highly influential. It'd be interesting, I'll look into this when I do the research for the next book, the extent to which reactions, you know who's actually worked on this? What's his name? Yuval Ivray? Isn't that his name? Yuval Ivray is in London. I remember now, he gave a talk on this at a conference in Harvard a few months ago about how Jews of Middle Eastern origin in the Yishuv were extremely uncomfortable with the Balfour Declaration. But again, they had no voice. So this is a paper about political leaders. But yes, I'm sure that, however, having said that, when I talk about the reaction of the United States, this is coming not from elites. This is the Poale Zion, which is a mass organization. The American Jewish Congress is not an elite organization. The American Jewish Committee is. The American Jewish Congress isn't. And so there's a lot of support among American Jews. Now, does that mean American Jews as a whole? No. I mean, Zionism is obviously a minority movement even in the United States. But there is this very excited moment, sort of late 17, 18, 19, things die down after that, when I think that there is a huge support for some kind of Jewish political independence in Palestine. And frankly, if you were to mention to American Jews in Philadelphia, let's say, who signed on to one of these documents, well, what about the Palestinian Arabs? What about their rights? I just think they wouldn't have even thought about it. They wouldn't even understand it. So we have to be very careful not to be anachronistic, right? And not to sort of attribute to these people a capacity for understanding a question that only became clear, at least on an international scale, much later.
Thank you.
Your last sentence, maybe there's another aspect of colonialism here, on the way they did think about the Palestinians, which was very much about, we will develop this country, economic prosperity. So there's another way of dependence on the other side. We will make the natives, so to speak, dependent upon our economic power, hence they will not be upset about our taking over this country. So I think there's another story there.
That's, I mean, you know, there's what they say and what you can interpret they say. I mean, there is this language of, just as we are grateful to Britain, they will be grateful to us. Right? We will come, we will develop their land. I mean, this is explicit in Neuland, where Rashid Bey says, of course, I mean, great, he uses the term, great gratitude. Grateful to the Jews for all the benefits they've brought. And that language shows up throughout the 1920s. Is it a cynical ploy to you know, is it dependence theory trying to, I'm not sure, but yeah, I mean, I think there is a desire to play the role of benevolent, superior civilizational power. On the other hand, Palestinians weren't terribly interested in that, and that famous exchange between Ben Gurion and Musa Alami in 1934, where Musa Alami says, I would rather this country remain barren for 100 years than that the technological development come from you. I'd rather wait until we can do it ourselves. So, but I agree that there was that kind of mission civilisatrice component to Zionism. It was also a way of explaining away Palestinian opposition. At least in the 20s, they would say, well, this is because it's a feudal and undeveloped society that is being dominated by its effendis. They had this notion of the feudal effendidom. And that once the Palestinians discover once they get over their false consciousness, they'll realize that their economic interests line up totally with those of the Zionists, which wasn't exactly the way that organized Palestinian laborers saw the situation. Yeah.
Thanks so much for the talk. I wonder whether the choice to kind of phrase a dependency on the UK or speak in terms of Commonwealth reflects not so much strategy as a lack of clarity about what Jewish identity really is. So in the sense that, on the one hand, defining Jews as a people by their similarity or complete overlap with the modern West. You know, the Jews are Jews because they're British, basically. They're modern, they're universalistic, they're moral, they're civilized and all that kind of thing. And therefore, the new Jewish state and its identity has to look something like the UK and be allied with the UK, versus a different idea that through the creation of a state, the Jews will completely redefine themselves. They'll truly be the chosen people and distinct. And the Jewish state will be the place where the new Jew, the new Hebrew, will be created. And maybe the elites you're looking at, they had a clear statement in the strategies they were pursuing, but maybe they couldn't figure out which direction they ultimately should go in. And maybe they still can't figure out exactly which direction.
Well, who was it who said history is what happens when life is what happens when you're making other plans? Isn't that John Lennon? Yeah. So the other Lennon. I mean, it's clear that there was a kind of, getting back to my earlier work, there was a technophilic aspect that was pretty much universal in early Zionism. Even before the term "making the desert bloom" was popularized, and that you could identify your right to Palestine, at least in part, by this developmental mission. And you see this in the statements by the American Jewish Congress and the Coalition, that there's going to be a paradise in Palestine, a land with no war, with no machines of war, swords will be beaten into plowshares and that sort of thing. So I don't know if that's a primary component of their Jewish identity, but I think it's very hard for them to think of their Zionism without that kind of technological, developmental, and utopian aspect. Yeah, very much so.
Hi.
Hello.
I'm just wondering if you could talk a little more about what seems to be a hovering, long-term historical story. Because when you were talking about Weizmann, you were talking about sort of Jewish politics over a long period of time, and how you saw this, at least in his framing and Herzl's too, as a longer story. But the thrust of much of what you're talking about is very much a sort of 20th century colonial or subset of colonial history, and how the Jews fit or didn't fit into it. So I'm curious how you see that longer story fitting in.
Yeah, well, it gets to this bigger question about, we've been talking about earlier today with some of the students, to what extent we fit Zionism entirely within or not at all within certain anti-colonial or colonial, anti-colonial, and post-colonial frameworks. Basically goes back to a book that I believe you co-edited on this subject. So, what can I say that wasn't already in the book? That, for this paper, when I was researching this thing about India, on the one hand, you've got this massive colony that has been under British control for a very long time, and you have a very well-developed Indian national movement, which has had its, I didn't talk about this in the paper, it's had its radical moment. The Ghadar movement during the last decade before World War I was violent. And these are the ones who were running around San Francisco. They went to Berkeley and Stanford, most of them. And these are the ones who were rounding up money to buy a ship and fit it with 10,000 rifles and send it to India. And you've got at the same time the German Hindu conspiracy, as it was called, right? This effort during World War I to get German and Indian nationalists to, actually they were going to wreak terrorist havoc on Canada. They were going to get Irish also to blow up the Welland Canal, so in Ontario. So you have a very militant Indian national movement in part, but for the most part, it's actually quite not quiescent, but it's not militant. And even when Gandhi in World War I had very much favored India being involved in the British war effort. So when does this all change? It happens slowly. It happens really. It's 1920 after World War I, but the real break only comes 1929, 1930. So this notion of being dependent, even if you don't want to be dependent, and being slow to rise to militants is not unique to the Zionists. So on one level, the Zionist dilemma is not unique, because it's shared by the Indians, for example. On the other hand, it's very different in that the Zionists, they depend on Britain for longer than most other colonized nations. And if they can't rely on Britain any longer, they can't do it themselves. But they don't have a patron state either. That's where they're unique, that they don't have a patron state. There are lots of, I wrote about that in my patron state article a couple of years ago. These other anti-colonial movements, they all have diasporas that help out to some extent, but they usually have a state to help them out as well. So the Zionists, in some levels, they do resemble these anti-colonial movements of the 20th century, and in some respects, they're entirely on their own. So that's, as usual, with everything I come up with, it's sort of a little mix of, somewhat colonial, somewhat anti-colonial, and even a pinch of post-colonial.
So I want to follow a little bit on what I think Ed was referring to, and I'm trying to articulate this. I think listening to your talk, I felt like this was one side of what the story of Zionism was about. It is the story of how do you bring about a political process. It's a Weizmann sort of tactic of doing that. There is another side of it, which is the revolutionary, self-transformative aspect.
Yeah.
But you stop in 1948, and I'm thinking, partly because of my own interest, that 1948, the generation of people who are born after 1948 in that state are people who, not because of their own will, but because of the process that culminated in 1948, had been transformed. And they were transformed because of a dynamic that existed in Zionism long before they were conceived.
Right.
And I'm curious as to how do you balance between these two? One, a very diplomatic, careful, in many ways traditional process, and the other, which is completely different. It's to change things in a to tear everything down and build something new, which of course has to do also with what happens in 1948, the tearing down so as to build something new, both yourself and others.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And, the militants, First of all, there's a difference between a kind of ethos of militancy, an ideal of the New Hebrew, Zakuf Kuma. I remember the first book I ever read in Hebrew was a biography of the Shomer, Alexander Zaid. It's a children's biography that my kibbutz parents gave me. And I remember chapter 1, Ish sheyodea letaken klei neshek, a man who knows how to repair, how to work with weapons of war, riflery or firearms. Anyway, so there is that. But the question is, in terms on the big international stage, what does it really matter? Until 1946, the events leading up to Operation Agatha, the common involvement of the Haganah, Irgun Lehi, and anti-British guerrilla activity, the terrorism of the Irgun and of Lehi, and so on. Then it becomes serious. And that is, after all, one of the reasons, historians still argue, why did the British throw in the towel? I mean, if Ben Gurion, as Gil Rubin has told us, was really willing to go along with the Morrison-Grady plan in the summer of 1946, why did the British throw in the towel just a few months later and turn the whole thing over to the UN? So Bruce Hoffman, a security studies expert, has written a kind of massive book, Anonymous Soldiers, so based on the Stern Gang's anthem, basically saying, the terrorism of the Jewish militant groups mattered. So that's part of the story. But even then you have the 1948 war, which clearly without the war there is no Israel. Absolutely. But then I'm wondering after 1948, now you have this empowered IDF, and you've got this kind of muscular, militarized culture. Fine. But it's still a very fragile state. And it still is dependent on an international community, and it needs protectors, however powerful it might be. First of all, where's the weapons going to come from? Right? They can't just make do with little homemade weapons like they had in 1948. They need real weapons. So they have to get them from France and then from the US. And I've just been thinking about this a lot in a much bigger sense in terms of Israel's status today. In 1987, I think it was, Israel was declared a MNNA, major non-NATO ally, which is a military status accorded by NATO to Japan and Australia and one other friendly country, I forget which one. Okay, so that means Israel is an ally, a country whose strategic interests are often seen as being akin to those of the NATO alliance. I think we know about the extent to which the American and Israeli military train together, the storage of American weaponry on Israeli soil, and so on. So in that sense, Israel is not just in search of a protector, it's an ally. But I still think of a very weak country that is entirely dependent upon diplomatic and military support, in this case from the United States. What if, the $38 billion funding package had not been signed during the last months, or the last year of Obama's second term? So I completely accept what you're saying about the new Jew, the military culture, and of course the firepower that Israel has rained down upon the Palestinians from 48 to our own day. Absolutely. But I still see a state that within the international community can't survive without protection. And so I'm trying to figure out theoretically the difference between a client, between a protected body, a client, and an ally. They're all a little different. And I see Israel still as very much, a protectorate, a protected state rather than a full-throated ally. So I'm still working it through. So I'm not denying the cultural element, it's there, but when you get to the realpolitik, I'm not so sure if it changes things that much. So.
Hi. So one thing you said earlier that stood out to me was about this, it's sort of inherent in this dependency argument, is the Jewish relationship to states in general and this desire to be mobilized. And in that, there seems to be these sort of ideas of inclusion and assimilation. And I wonder, in your research, if you could talk a little about if you see within this strategy dependency a shift after the events of 39 to 45, which are this sort of extreme rebuking of that idea of being mobilized, being included within like a state, and also how that dependency, how fear and a kind of like this external security threat, which is, the singular external security threat that emerges from 39 to 45, how that shifts the logic of dependency after that period?
So really, it sounds like what you're asking how the Holocaust
Yes.
works. Yeah, that's a great question. It's a funny thing. The famous line of Ben Gurion in 1939, "We shall fight Hitler as if there was no white paper. We shall fight the white paper as if there was no Hitler." As Gil Rubin shows, in many ways, the outbreak of the war was a godsend to the Zionists because the May 1939 paper had destroyed the Zionist project. And the outbreak of World War I, many Zionists thought, would be a source of liberation. There'd be a major war. They were already, 1 month into the war, forming committees to plan the post-war. They have institutes planning the post-war and what they can get out of it. And one thing they assume is there'll be a massive demographic. They don't predict the Holocaust. They think there'll be massive demographic upheaval in Eastern and Central Europe. There'll be millions of Jewish refugees. And of course, they'll need a place to go. So in a way, the Zionists entered the very beginning of the war with an almost optimistic feeling that they can come out of this war much better than where they were in May of 1939. So they're not yet completely destroyed emotionally. Their state of dependence on Britain during the war, they can see as quite empowering. And in fact, Ben Gurion wants Jews to sign up for the British forces, because the more Jews are in the British forces, and 30,000 wind up in the British forces, the more they learn how to be in an army. He wants them to learn how to do things that the Haganah didn't do very well, like follow a chain of command, and operate like an army. And so it's no coincidence that a number of the senior officers who commanded the IDF in its early years had been British staff officers during the war. I mean, that is the Jews from the Yishuv who had served in the British armed forces. So in any way, this is actually empowerment for the fledgling state of Israel, to have this kind of dependency relationship on Britain during the war. It's also a source of empowerment because they can use British military assistance for their own ends. So the British wanted there to be a mobile, permanent military strike force, basically to do things like attack Vichy Syria. This is the origins of the Palmach. And then now, thanks to this, you have a well-armed, well-trained military force that wasn't there before, which of course will become essential for the young state of Israel in 1947 to 1949. So dependence on Britain in World War II can actually be quite empowering. The Holocaust leads to a double sense of, I'd say, emotional devastation. First, there's the obvious fact that everybody loses near ones and dear ones, all Jews of European origin, which is the bulk of the issue in 1948. They lose their closest ones. But there's also the problem that, oh my God, all those Jews who were going to form the state of Israel are dead. 2/3 of the Jews of Europe are dead. Who's going to populate our new country? So then they think, okay, well maybe we'll draw on the Jews from the Middle East, or we'll get whatever we can from Eastern Europe. And so they begin to think very differently about the kind of borders that they need. And that's one reason why in 1946-47 the Zionists begin to say, okay, we want a state, but we're willing to live with smaller borders than the entirety of Palestine. So yes, they are emotionally devastated by the Holocaust, but it's also a demographic disaster for them. But it's interesting to think about the dependence on Britain during World War II. I mean, the way when you read Ben Gurion's memoranda during World War II about the Jewish army within the Allied forces and the role it can and should play, it's all about how we're going to use Britain for our purposes in the post-war peace conference, just like we did after World War I. Just like we did after World War I. There's that line that generals always fight the last war. So my notion is that policymakers always they're always planning for the last post-war. Other questions from students in particular? Especially students who came earlier and sat through the seminar early. Any questions?
If nobody else, I'll try one more. I was very intrigued by the talk. I'm even more intrigued by the comments just now about dependence and dependency. So it seems to me, I'm a complete outsider to the discourse, but it's rather obvious that any small nation is going to be dependent. That's just the nature of the world. Singapore is dependent ultimately on the U.S. for defense. Norway is dependent, and Israel is dependent. I think what's what's interesting is, whereas we wouldn't expect to see the head of state of Norway or the head of state of Singapore supporting an opposition candidate publicly in, say, an election,
Right.
or visiting the country after the election of a president and speaking before Congress. I'm not making a political statement, but
Hypothetically, you're
the,
talking
yeah, no, but in reality, the ability or willingness of the Israeli state or politicians to go to the power that they are ostensibly dependent on and engage in, for lack of a better term, chutzpah.
Yeah.
That to me is just objectively, that's something worth explaining, and I think that gets to what you're talking about, the nature of Zionism and some of the ethic and ethos and ideology of what this state is. This isn't Norway, it's not Singapore, and therefore the nature of its dependence is much more complicated, and in fact the tail can wag the dog under some circumstances. Whether we can celebrate that or not, but it just makes it interesting.
The tail can wag the dog. Sometimes the dog wags the tail. You know, in 1970, as Joel Migdal points out, in 1970, Israel did the U.S. a huge service when Israel basically threatened to intervene in the Jordanian civil war against Syria and on behalf of King Hussein, which is exactly what the Nixon administration wanted. And it was in Israel's best interests, too. But, you know, they did exactly what the Americans wanted. We assumed that this, attack against the Iranian base in Syria was also something that the Americans gave the green light to. Sometimes the tail wags the dog. The Israelis do all kinds of things that American administrations have found infuriating. The interesting question would be how and when Israel became not just a client state or a patron state, or even an ally, but a state that is pushing its own agenda to the point where it's really trying to influence, say, American domestic politics. And AIPAC was historically, there's a colleague from USC actually who's writing a history of AIPAC in the 1950s, this very mild, moderate organization that actually was founded due to the instigation of the US Congress. They wanted a kind of central address, like who are we going to talk to when we need to talk to somebody about Israel? So, they actually encouraged the creation of AIPAC, and it was totally bipartisan and remained that way for a very long time. So I suppose, I'm not going to do this in my next book. I suppose it might be fun to go into this further about not just how dependence becomes independence, but how independence then becomes intervention. Yeah, that would be a lot of fun. Or a great doctoral dissertation. Yeah.
Along those lines.
Along those lines, can you talk a little bit about when Israel gained the leverage over the United States and was no longer that client state so much? And yeah.
Good question. Obviously, the dependence is still there. Without the weapon, the state of Israel, what could it do without the weaponry? Yes, Israel has its own military industries, and they sell military, they sell weaponry abroad, but they couldn't survive without American military assistance. So the dependence is still there, but they've acted as an independent agent. In 1956, after the Suez incident, the Eisenhower administration was at least publicly furious with the state of Israel, although quietly it offered Israel a kind of informal security guarantee. So you could say that even then Israel came out of the 56 war, this egregious act of colonial sort of gunboat diplomacy. They came out of it in a stronger position. And in 1967, it was very clear to the American government that Israel was going to attack. And at no point did the Johnson administration ever tell Israel, if you do it, there will be consequences. They said things like, we urge you not to do it. But there was never a clear red light. Like, if you do it, there will be consequences. And of course, Israel went and did it. So I think this actually goes very far back, this kind of growing sense that Israel has a kind of latitude in its actions vis-a-vis the Arab world. On the other hand, there have been slaps in the wrist. 1973, it took the Nixon administration its own good time before they authorized the airlift, without which Israel might not have won the 1973 war. So I think this is a very gradual product. And then the Jonathan Pollard, which was early 90s, when was it? Early 90s? I lose track, it was so long ago. 80s already? Yeah. But I'm wondering typologically if the Jonathan Pollard affair is that different from what in Hebrew is called the Esek Bish, the shameful business in the early 1950s when Egyptian Jews were mobilized to plant bombs at American and British cultural and diplomatic installations in Egypt in order to discredit the Nasser regime, right? And that's chutzpah. And unfortunately, one of their operatives was a double agent for Egypt, so the whole thing got blown, and it was a very bad thing for Israel. So I'm wondering, this willingness of the State of Israel to act on its own, it might be something that far predates even 1967 or even 56.
Does it possibly stem from the utilization of or recognition of the influence that the diaspora has in American politics and using that as a sense of insurance, because any act by the United States against Israel would enrage many constituencies?
I don't think that was an issue until the Reagan administration. It's important here not to be anachronistic. The American Jewish community in 1948 was not nearly as politically mobilized on behalf of Israel as it would be many decades later. And there's a lot of speculation about why Truman, in his famous speech in 1946, the Yom Kippur Speech, argued that Britain should accept 100,000 Jews to Palestine. And some people say, there's elections coming up, and he was interested in the Jewish vote, but there were a lot of other things going on as well. Eisenhower in '56 had no interest whatsoever in Jewish political pressure. Nixon never seemed to care very much about Jewish political pressure. He had totally different reasons for supporting Israel. And I think a lot of this is a product of the growth of AIPAC in the 1980s, but I believe that AIPAC was actually brought to the surface not by its own energy, but by the political empowerment of evangelical Christians in the Reagan administration, who have been historically a much more important source of political support for Israel than the Jewish community. There's so many more of them. You talk about the vote. In the 1980s, there were something like 60 million evangelical Christians. Now the number is probably about the same, but the population's gone up, so their numbers seem to be going down. So I think this, again, is a process that really does not date back more than about 30 years. I don't think that the fear of the American Jewish community alone can really explain American foreign policy. In that sense, I differ from Walt, my Harvard and Chicago colleagues, Walt and Mearsheimer, who wrote a rather controversial book a few years back called The Israel Lobby, which I think does for Jewish influence a little bit of what Chaim Weizmann encountered when he was negotiating the Balfour Declaration, where the British interlocutors really believed that American Jews had the power to bring the Americans into World War I, and that Russian Jews had the power to keep Russia from leaving the war. I don't believe that Jews had that kind of power. At least if they did, I didn't get that memo. Yeah.
So I'm wondering if you see, you pretty clearly don't see waning Israeli dependence on the United States, but an increased Israeli willingness to buck the United States do you think that means that the U.S. has a lesser role to play in future iterations of the peace process, or why U.S.-led efforts like Camp David in 2000 have been less affected because there's more Israeli willingness to buck what the U.S. wants?
Yeah, I don't think the failure of Camp David II in 2000 was simply because of an Israeli desire to whistle in the face of the Americans. My colleagues who work on negotiation will say that the Camp David II summit was determined to fail because no party had trust in any other party. The Palestinians went into it unwillingly, unprepared. The Israelis went into it, admittedly, with swagger and with definitive demands that the Palestinians would not want to accept. The Americans, Clinton did not do an effective job trying to gain the trust of the parties. So, but I do think that obviously, this current administration is rapidly retreating from its ability to engage the international community. I cannot imagine this administration floating a proposal that could bring some kind of peace between Israel and the Palestinians. I think it's just beyond belief. But your question is how that has to do with issues of dependence.
Yeah, I was going to say, do you see Israel being less willing to come to the table now than in the past because they are more willing to buck what the U.S. wants. So even if this administration did want them at the table as compared to Israel 30 years ago, do you
Yeah.
think they would be less willing to do so as a result of this historical trend?
Problem is, I'm not sure how much we can explain the Israeli political elites as rational actors. That is, let's say Hillary Clinton had, oh, she did win the election, I'm sorry. Let's say she'd won the Electoral College and she was president of the United States now. Now remember, Hillary Clinton was extremely, and her whole life has been extremely supportive of Israel. I'm not sure if she would be presenting, I mean, she would be presenting a coherent plan that might be somewhat different from what the Trump administration is planning. Would that be enough to satisfy minimal Palestinian expectations? I'm not at all sure. It does seem that now Israel is sitting in a very strong position, partly because of the $38 billion defense package that the Obama administration signed, partly because of the geopolitical situation, in that the international community now has things that are much more worrisome than Israel-Palestine, with Russia, Iran, Syria, North Korea at hand, with the reconfiguration of the Arab world where Israel and Egypt are essentially allies, Israel and Saudi Arabia are becoming allies. The Palestinians have no major diplomatic support. This is not the days of the Cold War where they had support from China and from the Soviet Union. So in such an atmosphere, I think Israel is simply reading the geopolitical tea leaves. I don't think it's simply because of changes in American policy. The question is, and I don't have an answer, what would it take to get things to change? What would it take to get things to change? And I think it would take a number of things. It would take a different American administration, and it would take a series of exogenous shocks, some of them very unpleasant, that would directly affect Israel. We might see some of those shocks just in the coming weeks in terms of military involvement with Iran. I mean, I don't know what's going to happen. But there will have to be a change in the American administration, to be sure, but that won't be the only factor. I'm sorry I can't predict the future. I have a hard enough time figuring out the past.
I think this is the right time to move on. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.